Hello and welcome. My pronouns are we, vis, and you are listening to Outcast. So, in this episode, I'm going to answer the most Googled questions about trans people. You may have seen this type of format on YouTube videos, but if you're not familiar with it, what I did was type into Google things like are trans people, do trans people, and whatever, and answer the questions that came up with the autocomplete. So let's get into it. Are transgender and transsexual interchangeable? Not really. At this point, a lot of trans people don't really like the word transsexual anymore because it's outdated and kind of pathologizing in its history. Some people still use it, and some people do make the difference of transsexuals being people who medically transition. But personally, I think this distinction sometimes leads to people implying that transgender people are not really trans. It's mostly safe to say just trans rather than transgender, transsexual, whatever. But generally they're not really interchangeable, or they're not used like that. Are trans athletes unfair? That's a weird phrasing, because no, the fact that trans athletes exist isn't unfair. And the fact that trans athletes compete within their gender is also not unfair, because if anything, the system is the problem that groups people in by their gender. But also, for example, people mostly say this about trans women, but if a trans woman is on estrogen, they don't have the same advantages, whatever you want to say, that cis men have over cis women. This is simply not how this works. But the system in general is flawed, because intersex people are also subject to like strong regulations and stuff. So it really makes more sense to divide people based on hormone levels and weight and whatever, rather than just gender, because gender is just an identity. Are trans hormones reversible? That depends. For example, if someone were to take estrogen who was assigned male at birth, they will at some point grow breasts, which is not reversible. But pretty much everything else is reversible, because what happens with hormones is also that the fat redistributes within the body, but once you stop taking hormones, that effect will reverse. Same with testosterone, the fat redistribution will reverse, but what's not reversible is voice changes, the increase of body and facial hair, and the bottom growth, meaning the enlargement of the clitoris. Everything else would pretty much be reversible. Do trans people have to take HRT forever? No, they do not. I mean, that kind of depends, but like trans people don't have to do anything, even if they are like acting against what the doctor says. But someone can go on testosterone for like 6 months, 2 years, and then they could just stop. Same with estrogen. What might cause a problem is if they had surgery, for example, they have their ovaries taken out, or they have an orchiectomy, which is the removal of the testicles, because those produce testosterone or estrogen, and if you then stop HRT, your body does not produce enough natural hormones, and that can lead to things like depression and osteoporosis, and then you may need to take HRT still. Do trans people have both parts? I'm assuming parts means genitals. Generally, no. I think people are confusing trans with intersex, and not even all intersex people have both genitals. It is possible for someone to have a vagina and a micropenis, and this also is kind of what happens with trans people who take testosterone HRT when their clitoris grows into a micropenis, and then they have both a micropenis and a vagina, but generally this isn't necessarily true. Do trans women have cervixes? Generally no, unless the trans woman is intersex, she may have a cervix. Do trans men have cervixes? Generally yes, unless the trans man is intersex and does not have one. Do trans people get new parts? Again, I'm assuming parts refers to genitals here. Not all trans people do, no. A lot of trans people are actually very happy with the genitals they were born with and do not change them through surgery at all. Do trans people have different chromosomes? I mean, they have the same chromosomes that cis people can have. Transness has nothing to do with chromosomes. You again think of intersex people, and most cis people don't even know their chromosomes. Like, people always say like, oh, usually cis men have XY and cis women have XX, but how many cis people actually get their chromosomes tested? We don't really know what chromosomes we have. No one really does, unless you actually get them tested. Do trans people change their mind? Some trans people do change their mind, but It's less than 1% of trans people change their mind and detransition, and out of that, a lot of trans people actually retransition later, when the only reason they detransition in the first place may have been that they weren't accepted, or that it's very dangerous to be trans and they couldn't deal with the transmisia they experienced, or they've been pressured to detransition by their peers or by other people. Can trans people get pregnant? If the trans person has a functioning uterus, they can get pregnant. Even if the person has been on testosterone for a while, they can just stop testosterone and then they can get pregnant and give birth to a child. Can trans people have sex? Excuse me, what kind of question is this? Of course we can have sex. I mean, not all of us do, but we can have sex. Can trans men have kids? I already just went into this, but, well, what does having kids mean? I mean, you can adopt, but I'm assuming it means give birth to a kid, and as I just said, if a trans guy has a functioning uterus, and even if he's already been on testosterone, he can still get pregnant if he just goes off testosterone for a bit, and then he can go back on testosterone once he has given birth. Can trans people marry? That depends on the gender marker of the trans person and where they live. Do they live in a country where two people with the same gender markers can get married, or not? Because if a trans woman and a cis woman are together, but the trans woman still has a male gender marker, and they are in a country where same-gender marriage is not allowed, they could still get married because in the law it would be considered a straight marriage. But in some cases, it used to be the fact, like for example in Germany, in this case, where, for example, a trans woman and a cis woman were married and a trans woman would change her gender marker to female, that marriage would have to be divorced before they could change it because gay marriage is not allowed. But I think they stopped that, so trans people were allowed to be gay married before cis gay people. Can trans people get cervical cancer? Anyone with a cervix can get cervical cancer, so yes. It's just not all trans people, it's just those of us who have cervixes. How do trans men transition? I mean, that depends. It really depends on the person, but like, things that a trans man might do is change his name, change his pronouns, cut his hair, get new clothes, get a binder to compress his chest so it looks flat, go on testosterone to deepen his voice, get more body and facial hair, and that kind of thing, and also have genital surgery to create a penis. These are all things that a trans man can do, but this is not what they all have to do. How do trans men get T? Well, the regular route is getting diagnosed with gender dysphoria and going to the doctor and then getting prescribed T. But don't tell anyone, but it is possible to buy testosterone somewhere and then you just do it yourself. And this have been all the most Googled questions about trans people I can talk about in this episode. If you want to support me, you can subscribe to my Patreon. My Patreon is patreon.com/out_castpod. I'm also out_castpod on both Twitter and Instagram. My email address is gndrqr98@gmail.com. If you want to be featured on the podcast, you can send me a voice message. The link for that, just like all the other contact information, will be in the notes for this episode. That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care of yourself.